It's funny the things I notice years after they've already happened. Not because I missed them, but because they never asked for my attention. They quietly settled into everyday life until one day I looked around and realized something had changed. And that's the thought that's been following me lately. I couldn't tell you when it happened. I only know that it did. Somewhere along the way, being alone stopped feeling like something I needed to fill. Today, I'd love to walk with you through that season. But before we take another step, let's begin the way we always do and take a moment to slow things down. So get comfortable wherever you are, soften your shoulders, and take a breath with me. Take a slow breath in. And gently let it out. Wherever you are, allow yourself to arrive and walk gently into this space with me. Welcome to Find Your Way to Vibe. I'm Amber, and I'm really glad you're here. Now that we've had a chance to settle in, I'd love to share how I found my way to vibe this week. One thing I have been reminded of is how easily it is to drift out of balance. And lately, I've been pouring so much of myself into work and creating with Way2Vyb that before I knew it, most of my days were being spent sitting in front of the computer for hours. And I love what I'm creating. I genuinely do. But I realize that I am completely out of balance because one thing I have learned about myself over the years is that when I care deeply about something and find a really good rhythm with it, I have a really hard time putting it down, throwing me completely out of balance. And I tell myself just one more thing, then another hour goes by. And before I know it, I realize I haven't made much time for the things that help me feel most like myself. So this week, I started making those moments a priority again. I've been finding my way back to the yoga mat, spending a little more time with yoga and Tai Chi, and I've also been getting up and making a point to move throughout the day instead of staying glued to my chair. It's nothing dramatic, just small reminders that balance isn't something we find once. It's something we return to over and over again. That's one thing yoga has always reminded me, is that balance isn't about standing perfectly still. There are little adjustments happening all the time. Sometimes we wobble, and sometimes we lose our footing altogether. The practice isn't about never falling out of balance. It's about noticing, making the adjustment, and returning. And I think life asks the same thing of us. And maybe that's why I've been thinking so much about this next part of my story. I didn't know it at the time, but something had already begun to change. I don't quite remember the first quiet evening, but I do remember the feeling of those evenings. Dinner had been cleaned up, the dishes were put away, the house had settled into a familiar kind of stillness that only came after everyone had gone their own direction. For most of my life, evenings looked very different than that. They were much busier. By the time I came home from work, the evening already had a rhythm set. There were conversations to have, laundry waiting to be folded, dinner to make, the little moments that naturally filled a home with children. Then, almost without noticing, that rhythm began to change. My kids were growing up and they needed me differently. Before I realized it, the evenings had become much quieter And I found myself in a place of boredom, I guess is the best way to describe it. There was one night I remember that I wandered into the living room and I sat down for a while, wondering what I was going to do. So a few minutes later, I got up again. I turned on the television, tried to find something that piqued my interest. Nothing looked interesting, so I turned it back off. Then I picked up my phone. I scrolled for a little while, then I set it back down again. I then walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, closed it because I realized I wasn't hungry and I didn't need anything. I just didn't know what to do with myself. I wasn't used to not having somewhere to be or someone to take care of or having some responsibility to do. That's when I started noticing things I never really paid attention to before. Like how quiet the house could become, or how loud my own thoughts could become, or even how long an evening could feel when no one needed anything from me. I didn't know what to do with that at first, so I wandered. Eventually, I found myself spending more and more time in my backyard. I never planned for that to happen. The backyard simply became the place I ended up whenever I wanted a little space or whenever I found myself getting a little bored. Some days I'd take a book outside and sit by the fire and read while I listened to the sounds of the night. Other days, I'd bring out my journal and write down whatever had been on my mind that day. And every now and then, I'd pull out Kayla's paints and spend a little time painting. Or I'd simply just sit beside the fountain listening to the water. There didn't have to be a reason. I just really enjoyed being out there in nature and amongst the beauty that I was surrounded by. And looking back now, I think it was one of the first places where I truly felt at peace. The interesting thing was, as I found more peace outside, I started noticing something changing inside the house as well. I never really thought much about it before, but every home I've ever lived in reflected the season of life I was in. As a little girl, home reflected my parents. When I got married, we started the same way many young couples do, with hand-me-downs from family and friends and whatever we already had. When I moved back to California, I was living with my parents again, so naturally, their home reflected them. A few years later, I moved into another home, but most of it had already been chosen without my input. Then one day, I found myself standing in a little house that echoed more than it held. And for the first time, it felt like I had a blank canvas of my own. The only things that we brought with us from the move from the other house were our personal belongings and the kids' beds. I went and bought an air mattress, and for a while, that was enough. As time went on, the house slowly began to feel more like a home, and as we filled it with the furniture. I still smile when I think about wandering through the furniture stores looking for our couch. I had a couch in mind that I wanted, but I still wanted to go and just sit in all the various couches to see if it's really the one that I wanted. So I'd go in and we'd sit on a couch, we'd walk away, go sit on another couch, then we'd come and sit on that same couch again, walk away, go test another one out. And what I realized is that we kept coming back to the same couch. And we weren't really shopping at that point, I realized. Instead, we were just paying attention to how each couch felt And the couch that we kept coming back to ended up being the one that we took home with us because it just felt good to all of us. And once the furniture started finding its place, I found myself looking at the walls. And the walls started to fill with paintings that my kids and I have created over the years. And it felt so good to just hang up those pieces of us. One thing that I was really excited to unpack was my bin of shot glasses that I had been collecting since I was 12 years old. They had spent years tucked away in a storage bin just waiting for a place to belong. And I just smiled as I lined them up across the shelves because they finally had a place to belong. And on top of that, it was fun because as I was putting them all up on these shelves, memories started coming back to me. The memories of the trips we'd taken, or who I got different shot glasses from as a gift. And I mean, they just all became a little piece of our story. And so it was really fun to be able to finally have a place for something that I had collected for so many years. And one thing I realized once I was finished with the home and we had put everything where it belonged and we furnished it and we hung paintings on the wall is that nothing in that house had been chosen because it matched. It was there because it belonged. And I really loved when people would come over to my house and they would look around and say, "This house is so you." I always smiled at that because I hadn't been trying to create a certain style of any kind. I'd simply been surrounding myself with pieces of our story. I was creating a space that was the story of me and the kids. And I was really grateful that people saw that when they walked into our home. And so it made it even that much more difficult when years later it came time to move again. And I had to start letting go of pieces of that time in our life. It was hard. It was hard to let go of those things. But I also knew that another blank canvas was waiting for us somewhere along the way. So I kind of came to peace with it all. The only thing that we held on to from that home, besides our personal belongings and my piano that I've carried with me since I was 12 as well, is the couches. It was the one thing we couldn't part with. My kids loved them. I loved them. So it was unanimous that the couches were coming with us onto our next adventure. One of the memories that stayed with me most during that season of my life happened on the Christmas after we moved into our new home. It was also the first Christmas I had ever spent completely on my own, so it was all very new for me. My kids were with their dad, and the rest of my family that lived here that we usually spent Christmas with they were all traveling elsewhere that year. So I just kind of had the day to myself. And I remember waking up to the house that just felt really quiet. And more than anything, I just missed my kids because most every Christmas before that had started with their excitement. There was always that moment when they'd wake up before the sun, and before long the whole house felt alive. And so that morning for me was very different. And as the day unfolded, I didn't do much. One, because I was sick, but also because I found myself thinking about all the Christmases before. The Christmases when I was little, Christmas mornings with my own kids. and the wrapping papers scattered across the floor, the laughter, the excitement that always seemed to fill the room when children were around. I didn't try to push those memories away. I actually kept them coming because they kept me company. And with me being sick, it was perfect for me to just rest and have those moments of remembrance. And while most everybody was spending their time around the Christmas tree, I was in urgent care. And I still laugh thinking about that because what were the odds? But now I do feel like it was a divine intervention of sorts, because my life had been so busy up to that point with moving and all of that stuff that I feel like I got sick because my body really just needed time to rest. And that's what I did. I stayed in bed most of the day and watched Christmas movies. And then eventually I got hungry and I ordered myself some sushi because it was the only place open and the only place that delivered. And I wasn't cooking and I wasn't going anywhere. So it was perfect. So that Christmas, it may have not been the one that I would have planned, but it was the one that I needed. And somewhere in that ordinary day, I stopped. I didn't really wish for anything different. And when I think back on it now, I don't remember spending it alone. That's not what sticks with me. What sticks with me is that I discovered that I could be gentle with myself even when life didn't unfold the way I had imagined. And I think that Christmas always also gave me permission to stop expecting every day to look a certain way. As that season of my life came to an end, another one quietly began. And after learning to stop expecting every day to look a certain way, I started living life in a way that I was creating the day how I wanted it to look. And of course, I had to integrate it in with my work and life responsibilities of being a mom and all of that. But one thing that I noticed when I started doing that is I found even more places where I felt most at home with myself. And I needed that, especially after we moved from the house with the backyard and the beautiful garden and the fire and the fountain, because I needed to now find a new space to be when I needed to get away. And if you've been walking with me for a while, you probably heard me mention my garage more than once. And it probably sounds a little funny because most people think of a garage as a place to park a car, store their items, or even a workshop. Mine became one of my favorite places to just be. And I would just, whenever I needed a little space, that's where I'd naturally find myself, either sitting in my chair, observing the world around me, or throwing out my yoga mat on the ground and doing yoga or meditating, or just lying there listening to the world around me. Whatever it was, that space became almost like a friend to me, because it really just held space for me as I went through whatever I was going through. And what was really neat about where we lived is the new home that we moved into had a detached garage. So we had a space between the house and the garage that allowed for us to kind of move behind the house. And it served as kind of a pathway for the wildlife where we lived. And it became busy with the wildlife. So every now and then I would hear rustling in the bushes, or I would hear something scraping along the fence. But whenever I heard something, I had to stop and just listen. Because living where we were, as close as we were to the mountains, that pause mattered. Because it was either you'd turn the corner and you'd catch yourself facing a bear, or you'd turn the corner and you'd maybe face a squirrel or a cat or even a skunk. You just never knew what you were going to encounter. And most times it was one of the smaller critters, but it still spiked the anxiety because you couldn't tell. Sometimes the bears were quiet. When they crash through something, they're not as quiet, but when they're just kind of walking on the pathway, you can't really hear them. So either way, I learned not to rush the next step. And then, of course, there were moments that still make me laugh because there were times when I would be in the garage and I would be meditating or I'd start my meditation, and then all of a sudden I would start hearing the crickets chirp. And then I'd open my eyes and I would see one fling across the garage, and then I'd see another one fling across the garage. So I would be nervous to go into meditation because I didn't want the crickets hopping all over me. And so it took me a while to get there, but the crickets taught me how to meditate through distraction. And I think that was an important thing for me because of the way that we live life these days. Distractions are everywhere. So those little crickets became a very delicate teacher for me. And it helped improve my meditation because I had to put that out of my mind and not worry about whether a cricket was going to hop on me or not, because that was my biggest thing. Or, of course, another thing that could happen is a spider crawl across you. Luckily, I sprayed often because I did have black widows, but it was very rare that I came across a spider when I was meditating that I know of. And I'd rather leave it that way because I don't want to know if I had spiders crawling on me. I figured I would know, but the point is, I learned how to improve on my meditation because of those moments that still make me laugh today. And I'm grateful for those moments because of what it taught me. And of course, I've had many moments with squirrels. In our neighborhood, we have a big oak tree that was over our garage. So there were several squirrels that lived in that tree. And I would often find myself having a little staring contest with one of those neighborhood squirrels. And we would just stare at each other, waiting for each other to make the next move. But eventually, we'd both decide the other wasn't all that interesting. So then we'd just go back to whatever we were doing. But it was a lot of fun. And I had a lot of fun watching the squirrels go from the fence to the orange tree that we had to the roof and then jump into the tree. Like, I had a lot of fun memories of the animals around us because we just had such an abundance of them where we lived, and that was another highlight of living where we did. The garage also served as a space for me to feel my emotions. Some days I'd feel really heavy and I'd go out there and I would just cry, sometimes for hours. I don't know why, it was just what happened. And you know, it just really was a space for me to express what I was feeling and not worry about what other people were feeling, or more so my kids didn't have to feel responsible for me in a way. I didn't want them thinking there was something wrong with me. I was just going through emotions. I was processing things. I was healing. So I found myself out in the garage crying a lot. And it was important to do that for myself because I had to get those things out. And if I didn't cry, I would just lie there, kind of like when I would lie on my floor and listen to music or just stare up at the ceiling. And some days I'd feel a little lighter as I left, and other days I felt worse or nothing changed at all. But one thing that I did was that's where I kept going back to, because it did hold that space for me. And I am so grateful for my garage. And yes, I know that sounds a little crazy, but that's how I processed my life at the time. And for me, it was helpful. And I will always have gratitude because it held me up when I didn't feel like I could go to anybody else. And it made room for all of me. My tears, my laughter, my fear, even holding space when I did my New Year's walks, and just being there when I came back from each lap, and being that safe space for me to take a break. It just was all really a wonderful place to be. And none of those moments took away from the life I was trying to build. It just became a part of it. And most days before heading back inside, I would turn around and I would share my gratitude towards the garage, because it wasn't a person, but it was a space. And I felt that gratitude because everything about it gave me a peace that I otherwise wouldn't have had. And because of that space that I had, I started to notice that my attitudes would shift. So if I was feeling rather heavy and I would spend time in the garage, I'd come back and feel a little lighter. And over time, it just started to build up. So I was just lighter and lighter and lighter. And that's when I found myself inviting myself to do more singing and dancing while I cooked in the kitchen, or being silly with my kids, or just doing things that felt good. Years earlier, I would have been far too self-conscious to be dancing around the kitchen, even though nobody was looking or anybody was like, even if nobody else was home, I would still feel subconscious about doing that. And so now, maybe not so much now because I don't cook as much dinner these days, but I hardly give it a second thought. I just go with it. And I remember that I get to create the space my day is in. So there's that. My lovely garage. The trails became another place I loved to be. And many of my favorite mornings began long before sunrise. I'd usually step onto the trail while everything was still half asleep, and I'd begin walking before the first light reached over the mountains. There was something about those early morning hours that just felt different. The air carried a kind of stillness that never seemed to last once the day was fully awake, and I felt really lucky to experience that kind of stillness. And something even better is that some mornings the trails were wrapped in this really cool mist, which became one of my favorite environments to hike in. And then other mornings, the sky was perfectly clear. Before the sun ever reached over the mountains, the sky would become this deep shade of blue. I have never seen this kind of blue before, so it's one that has stuck with me. And I look forward to seeing that whenever it wanted to show itself to me before the sun rose. So it was important for me to be out on the trails bright, or like not even bright, just early enough before the dawn hit that I could even try to catch a glimpse of those deep blue skies. And I mean, I still don't even know how to describe that blue. I just know that I felt very lucky to get to witness that. And almost without warning, once I caught the blue, all of a sudden the colors would just begin to change. Every once in a while, you'd get the usual orange and yellow kind of sunrise, especially if there was no clouds. But there were some mornings where the clouds and the environment was just right, where these soft pinks and purples and golds would just paint themselves across the sky, and they were gorgeous. I was in awe in most days when I got to catch those kind of sunrises. And they didn't last long, because before long the sun would finally peek over the mountains and the sky would be its normal kind of sky, with just the blue sky with the clouds, or just the blue sky and the sun. But I was really excited every morning that I got to witness one of those incredible sunrises. And more than once, I caught myself wondering if this was what heaven looked like, because it felt like it. And I rarely hurried through those first few miles of my hike because of what I got to witness and everything that there was to notice. Every now and then, I'd slip off my hiking shoes and finish part of the trail barefoot, just letting the cool earth settle beneath my feet, because somehow it made me pay attention even more. The trail was never the same twice. Some days the wildflowers lined the path for what felt like miles, and other days the landscape looked completely different. No matter how many times I returned there was always something waiting to be noticed. Sometimes it was a deer quietly stepping onto the trail ahead of me, completely unaware that I had stopped to watch. And sometimes it was a waterfall I'd visit dozens of times that somehow still made me stop. And every once in a while, I'd look out across the mountains and catch the Los Angeles skyline stretching out in the distance. And it always amazed me that one of the busiest cities in the world could be right there, just beyond the horizon, while I had this trail almost entirely to myself. On many days, it was rare when I saw another person on the trails with me that early. And it wasn't just the views that kept bringing me back. It was the wildlife too. One of my favorite things was hearing the owls finishing their night just as the birds began welcoming the morning. For a few quiet minutes, both worlds seemed to exist together. And I'd stand there just listening as one slowly gave way to the other. It almost felt like witnessing a conversation that I wasn't supposed to hear. And those mornings became one of the reasons I kept coming back. Another reason is that most mornings I had the trails almost entirely to myself. I usually wouldn't see another person until I was nearly back at the trailhead. And I really appreciated the time I had with myself on the trails, because there was no interruptions from other people. But when that first good morning hit, it always felt like the trail gently handing me back to the rhythm of everyday life. But for a little while, it had been just me, the mountains, and whatever they decided to share with me that morning. Looking back, I think those mornings were teaching me something I didn't have the words for yet. The more at home I became with myself, the bigger my world became. As we step onto today's trail of gratitude, I want to share my gratitude for the ordinary places that quietly held me while I was becoming someone I enjoyed spending time with. At the time, they just felt like everyday places. A backyard, a little house, a garage, a trail before sunrise. None of them seemed especially remarkable. They were simply where life happened. Looking back, I realized they were offering me something I didn't even know I needed. Space. Space to slow down, to notice, to listen, to become acquainted with myself. I think we spend a lot of time searching for the next place that's going to change us. Sometimes the places that shape us most are the ones we return to again and again. The ordinary ones. The ones waiting just outside our front door. This week, I'm grateful for every one of those places and for the quiet way they help me find my way back to myself. Before we finish today's walk, I'd like to take a moment for one of my favorite parts of every episode, Brooklyn Lights the Way. Brooklyn Lights the Way is a way of honoring Brooklyn's legacy by recognizing the people whose quiet presence leaves the world a little brighter. This week, Brooklyn Lights the Way honors the people who make us feel at home. The people who create spaces where we don't have to pretend, where we don't have to perform, and where we don't have to become someone different before we belong. Sometimes those spaces are created with words. Sometimes they're created with quiet understanding, and sometimes they're created simply because someone chooses to meet us exactly where we are. Brooklyn had a beautiful way of doing that. She reminded people, as well as myself, that being yourself was enough. I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give another person, to create a space where they feel safe enough to become more of themselves. If you've been someone who has offered that kind of space to another person, thank you. And if you've been fortunate enough to have someone like that in your own life, I hope you know what a remarkable gift they've been. As we come to the end of the trail today, I keep coming back to one quiet realization. When I first found myself with more time alone, I thought I needed to figure out what to do with it. What I didn't realize was that it wasn't asking me to do anything at all. It was simply inviting me to be with myself. Today, I can see it was never one conversation or one decision that changed me. It was the ordinary moments I kept returning to. Looking back, they were changing me long before I realized they were. Maybe that's why those ordinary moments matter so much. They give us a chance to slow down, to notice, and to become a little more familiar with the person we've been walking beside all along. So this week, I hope you find a little time for yourself, because you deserve to know the person you'll spend your whole life becoming. Until next time, walk slowly, breathe deeply, and may you always find your way to vibe.